I'd like to begin by welcoming all of our listeners to episode 1 of the Roaring Mind podcast and thanking you for taking the time to listen in today. We are Group 9, and in this episode, we'll be exploring the key psychological developments of 1920. My name's Melissa.
My name is Julia.
I'm Paris.
I'm Mary.
I'm Aaliyah.
And we're excited to take you on a journey back in time to get a glimpse of how psychology started to take shape during the year 1920.
So let's just provide a little context. The 1920s and the beginning of psych was pretty crazy, and that might have to do something with some of the founding theories developed as we're going to talk about. The 1920s or the Roaring Twenties was a time of revolution, celebration, and experimentation. After the war, people returned home with heads held high and more money in their pockets than ever because of the economic boom. Social norms were quickly changing as people felt a stronger desire to live to their fullest extent after the war and Spanish flu pandemic. This marked the start of mass consumerism, credit systems, stock markets, and increased wages, and of course, an influx of some possibly questionable psychological theories.
With that being said, we move on to the Little Albert Experiment by Watson and Rayner. A lot of psychology students know this study as it's commonly talked about. It stands out as a seminal yet controversial example in the history of psychology, illustrating how emotional responses can be acquired through classical conditioning. In this study, a 9-month-old infant, known as Albert B., was exposed to a series of neutral stimuli, including a white rat, a rabbit, and a mask, none of which initially provoked fear. However, after reportedly pairing the white rat with a loud, distressing noise, Watson and Rayner observed that Albert began to display fear responses to the rat alone. Over time, his fear generalized to other similar objects, such as a fur coat and a Santa mask. These findings provided empirical support for behaviorism, reinforcing the notion that behavior, including emotional reactions, could be understood and modified through observable stimulus response associations. This emphasis on measurable behavior reflects the empiricist tradition, which posits that knowledge and learning are derived from experience rather than innate reasoning. From a historical and critical perspective, the Little Albert Experiment exemplifies psychology's transition from its philosophical roots in rationalism and introspection toward a more specific empirical discipline. Emerging in the early 20th century, behaviorism sought to distance psychology from metaphysical speculation, focusing instead on observable and quantifiable behavior. Yet, the study's methodological limitations and profound ethical issues, including the absence of informed consent and the failure to decondition the child's fear, highlight the moral evolution of psychological research practices. Philosophically, the experiment reflects ongoing tensions between empiricism and rationalism, as well as between mind and body, echoing debates traced back to figures such as Descartes and Hume. Ultimately, the Little Albert case serves as both a cornerstone of behavioral psychology and a cautionary reminder of the discipline's ethical responsibilities, illustrating how the pursuit of scientific objectivity must always be balanced with respect for human welfare and moral accountability.
Okay, so now we are going to kind of shift things. We're going to talk about Freud a little bit.
I came across an article while researching for this episode that was about the translation of Freud's work into English. And honestly, I didn't expect it to be that deep. I thought, okay, Freud wrote in German, someone translated it, done. But it turns out the whole process shaped the way people actually understood his theories. And when you think about it in terms of language and psycholinguistics, which we've been covering in class, it makes total sense. The words you choose, especially for big ideas like id or ego, can totally shift how a theory is interpreted even across cultures. I ended up reading this article by Gigi Maynell, called Freud Translated, an historical and bibliographical note. It's from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And and honestly, I thought it was just going to be dry historical stuff. But it's actually kind of fascinating and super relevant to what we've been learning in class about psycholinguistics. The article breaks down how Freud's work was translated from German into English, mostly during the 1920s. And what really stood out to me is how translation wasn't just a technical thing, it was actually a form of interpretation. Translators weren't just changing the language, they were reshaping the meaning of Freud's entire theory of the mind and a completely different audience. One example Maynard talks about is how Freud's terms like is, ich, and über ich, which literally translate to it, I, and over I, were turned into id, ego, and superego. Which, yeah, we're all familiar with those terms now, but they weren't neutral choices. They were made to sound more formal and scientific in English, maybe to help legitimize psychoanalysis to an English speaking audience that was still kind of skeptical. And this ties directly into the stuff we've been discussing in our course, especially around how language influences thought, like this Wolf hypothesis and linguistic relativity. The words we use can literally shape the way we think about concepts. So when Freud's work was translated, those word choices didn't just affect how readers understood the text, they changed how people thought the unconscious human behavior and even how we describe ourselves. There's also this broader psycholinguistic point. Freud's ideas are super abstract. He talks about internal drives, repression, dreams, and trying to capture all of it in another language means you're constantly making judgment calls about meaning. And those decisions can influence how psychological theories evolve. In a way, the translators became co authors of Freud's ideas in English. Manow also points out that Freud was actually involved in this process. He worked with translators like James and Alex Strachey in the 1920s, especially when the Hogarth Press started publishing his work in English. He didn't just hand it off and hope for the best. He was really invested in how his work would be received, and made me think about how aware he was that language itself had power, which is honestly pretty psycholinguistic of him. So yeah, I came into this thinking, cool, let's talk about translation, but what I realized is that translation is deeply connected to how we construct meaning, especially when it comes to psychology. Freud didn't just get translated, he got reframed through language. And that's what makes this not just a story about publishing, but a story about how language shapes the way we understand the mind.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I think like you can't directly transfer from one language to another. There's always going to be some sort of decisions and things that need to be made by the translator. So like even mentioning how there's now co-authors of his work, I think that's like really important to recognize because they did a lot of that decision making on his terms and things like that, which shapes what we study, right? Um, so just moving on to Freud's work itself, his essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920, marked a turning point in psychoanalytic theory, as he challenged the idea that human behavior is guided only by the pursuit of pleasure. In his essay, Freud defines the pleasure principle as the mind's fundamental tendency to seek pleasure by reducing tension and avoiding pain. However, he points out that this drive is often controlled by the reality principle, which allows individuals to postpone pleasure in favor of long-term survival and adaptation to the external world. In today's world, for example, imagine a student who wants to go out with friends the night before an exam. The pleasure principle pushes them to seek immediate enjoyment and avoid the discomfort of studying and having to focus, while the reality principle helps them recognize that failing the exam could negatively impact their final mark in the course, their GPA, and in extension, graduate applications, and so forth. So they decide to stay home and study instead, right? Postponing that short-term pleasure of going out for long-term success and stability in the future
Yeah,
with graduate studies.
Yeah,
I
because this
definitely feel like that as well.
same.
And that's exactly it, right? Like that's that reality principle he's talking about. He then goes on to note how people repeat painful experiences like trauma survivors reliving distress or reoccurring nightmares At this point, he introduces the concept of repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive that operates beyond pleasure or reason. So, to explain this, he proposes a deeper, fundamental instinctual force, the death drive, which he refers to as thanatos. He describes thanatos as an unconscious drive pushing all life towards stillness and a return to an inorganic state. This force operates in tension with eros, which is the life instincts that drive love, connection, creativity, and survival. Together, these opposing forces, Eros and Thanatos, form the foundation of Freud's new theory of mind, suggesting that human life is defined by a constant struggle between the drives for creation and destruction, which exemplifies a shift from pleasure to conflict and tension. He suggests that this tension shapes our capacity for love, connection, and creativity, and our impulses towards aggression, repetition, and self-destruction. This dual drive theory became a cornerstone of later psychoanalytic thought, influencing fields from psychology and philosophy to cultural theory. Going back to that studying example, both of these drives can be seen at play. The eros drives the motivation to learn and succeed in study, while the thanatos might arise as temptation to give in and go out, which can lead to procrastination and such. Ultimately, the tension between these two drives shapes the student's behavior and decision making, reflecting Freud's idea that human actions are influenced by both creative and destructive forces. Following this publication and World War I in 1921, Freud moved on to publish another essay titled Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, exploring how identification with a leader or a group motivates behavior. His work reveals how love, authority, and unconscious emotional ties shape not only individual psychology, but also the dynamic of groups, institutions, and societies. Building upon Le Bon's ideas about the contagion and hypnosis, explaining how emotions spread through a group and how people become suggestible under a leader's influence, Freud rather suggests that groups are held together by emotional bonds, specifically love and identification with a leader, which creates like a sense of unity, but also reduces that sense of individuality and self-control. This introduces the idea of identification, where Freud describes how people give up part of their individuality to feel connected to the group. These ideologies still shape leadership, conformity, and even modern political movements today. Think about how people follow social media influencers, right? Supporters often adapt the leader, which in this case would be the influencer's views, their language, their attitudes, right? Feeling a sense of connection and belonging within that community. This identification with the influencer and fellow followers can strengthen group unity and motivation, but can also lead individuals to suppress their own critical thinking or personal opinions to align with the group's belief.
I think that's a really relevant example. That really goes to show how Freud's ideas about group psychology still apply in today's digital world.
Yeah, it also puts it into perspective how like social media influencers can act as the modern leaders by shaping how we think, feel, and behave because we just want to fit in with them.
Exactly. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Paris. Like, I feel like sometimes these like influencers or big like social media people don't truly realize like the true influence they have on others, which just goes to highlight like that sense of responsibility that comes with having such a large platform, right? Words, actions, opinions, they shape how people think, behave, and even view themselves, which can either be super positive or have like really negative effects. And I think we can see that in a lot of different scopes of the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like even now, like if it's a small town influencer or something, you always compare what you have to what they have.
Oh, 100%.
All right, so I was actually reading this article about object relations theory by Kenneth Thomas, and I found this information about Melanie Klein very interesting. But to start, ORT is a psychoanalytic theory that argues personality is shaped through early relationships with significant people. Melanie Klein was a psychoanalyst from Vienna, Austria, born in 1882. She endured depression due to a turbulent family life and unhappy marriage, leading her to seek a psychoanalysis. In her early career, she aspired to become a physician but couldn't because of a lack of resources. She soon pivoted to psychoanalysis and trained under Sandor Ferenczi and Carl Abraham. Her perspectives were somewhat revolutionary for the time, veering away from some of Freud's more popular theories. When it comes to the psychoanalytic theory, Mary proposed a shift away from the Oedipus complex and more so focused on the mother-child relationship in early infancy. She also believed that in such relationship, the infant is primarily driven by aggression and envy, not sex, like Freud argued. Unlike Freud, she also believed the superego develops before the phallic stage and is driven by envy and guilt. One defense mechanism she proposes that infants call infants do this thing called splitting. Essentially, they categorize objects and interactions into two categories, good and bad. Good things are gratifying or safe, and bad things are distressing and dangerous, obviously. Using this theory, she developed psychological positions that identify how an infant's relationship with the good and bad objects may result in certain mental illnesses later in life. For example, in the infant's earliest stage, the paranoid schizoid position, in which the infant fears intensely of the bad aspects of the object, like the mother in her breast or an absence of such. The infant would use splitting to make sense of the good and bad objects. If this remains unresolved, the infant may develop severe psychosis later in life, as theorized by Melanie. Remember how I mentioned that one of her or some of her theories contradict Freud's? Anna Freud, Freud's youngest daughter, did not find that very fun. In fact, they had beef of sorts, constantly clashing and disagreeing during scientific debates. Fundamentally, they could not agree on how and when one's personality develops. I was reading another article actually about Melanie Klein by Malby Oliver, and she developed the play technique, which was super revolutionary in psychoanalysis, allowing a child to freely play and be analyzed by psychologists essentially became the child equivalent of free association done by adults. Melanie believed that through play, childhood communicate their inner world and unconscious mind, and through interactions with toys express their relationships with objects or parents. For example, aggressive play like crashing cars into each other may express an inner conflict between good and bad, or frustration towards the parents. This is exactly what Anna Freud disagreed with. She believed that young children's egos too fragile for such aggressive interpretations and went as far to say that it can damage personalities.
I'll be speaking on Karen Horney for a little bit, regarding the feminist perspective. From 1919 to 1921, Karen Horney initiated the development of fundamental concepts that would subsequently transform psychoanalysis via feminist lens. During this critical phase, she functioned both as a practicing analyst and a professor at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, where she began to contest fundamental aspects of the Freudian theory, especially its premises regarding female psychology. Horney refuted Freud's notion of penis envy, contending that such concepts are not biologically inherent, but are actually socially produced responses to systemic gender inequalities. This was derived from Horney's Feminine Psychology, 1992, transcription. She contended that women's psychological challenges arise more from cultural and interpersonal pressures in patriarchal systems than from inherent inferiority. During these years, through her lectures, case studies, and informal writings, Horney established the intellectual groundwork for what would be recognized as feminine psychology. These preliminary findings culminated in her seminal 1922 article, Feminine Psychology, which aggregated and elaborated on the concepts she formulated between 1919 and 1921. Her contributions during this period were notable divergence from the Freudian orthodoxy, indicating a wider transition in psychoanalysis and psychology towards acknowledging the influence of environment, culture, and gender on identity and mental health. By emphasizing social context rather than biological determinism, Horney's initial contributions created new avenues for comprehending neurosis and development, particularly in women. So, essentially, emergence of women seen as intellectual authorities in this field of psychology. Karen pushed these barriers and was an influential figure in the history of psychology. And I think it's important to highlight the importance of women's contributions in this field.
I totally, sorry, just to like jump in. I
Yeah.
feel like that's so important because we're always hearing about, you know, like the big males of the field of the time, right? The Freud, the Watson, Wanda, Carl Jung, like we're hearing all those names. And I feel like women are forgot about sometimes, right? But they
Exactly.
had just as significant contributions that like shaped the field today, right? So I think that's really important that you brought that up.
100%. And I also really want to put in notion or kind of highlight her shift of deterministic or the shift of deterministic biological perspective and how it kind of shifted to environment, culture, and gender roles that shape identity. I feel like she played a major influence towards that shift, along with many other psychotherapists.
Oh, 100%. And I think too, like that kind of also corresponds with like the years of those couple years of the
Yeah.
1920s, right? That women gained their right to vote in America. Like I think that goes really like hand in hand and it's very like empowering to recognize.
And lastly, I just want to highlight as well, she placed emphasis on interpersonal relationships that cause neurosis. So what if neurosis wasn't hardwired into us? Rather, it's just something that society taught us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. Definitely something to think about. I think that does wrap us up. Thank you, Julia. Hopefully, we've given you some food for thought and sparked your curiosity to explore how the psychological ideas of 1920 helped shape the fields of psychology as we know it today. Thanks again for listening in, and hopefully, we'll catch you in our next episode. We'll see you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.